Welcome, Ross. I'm really excited to have you on the podcast after we have sat with our thoughts and feelings about how my clock is counting down when I'm recording and yours is counting up. So we don't know what's going to implode and happen this side, but I'm very pleased to invite you onto the podcast.
Well, thank you so much. I'm super pleased to be here, even with a bizarre clock antics going on.
Yeah, it's very, very melodramatic. It is now counting up and nothing has imploded. So we will just pause and sit with it. We are very excited to hear more about ACT today, acceptance and commitment therapy. And for those of the listeners who are brand new to this concept, how would you explain what ACT is and what it isn't, Ross?
Oh, blimey. Great question to start with.
You can start in whichever end you want of that one.
Yeah. ACT is, I think what I'll do is take the angle from the workplace, Michaela, the workplace angle and how we introduce it to people in the workplace. But just a bit of a backstory for ACT. ACT has been around for decades now. And initially it was used in a variety of therapeutic settings. And for the past 20 plus years, there's been a body of researchers and practitioners using ACT in the workplace. So that is my speciality, using acceptance and commitment therapy in the workplace. And it forms part of a bigger stable, if you like. It sits under contextual behavioral science. So I also use other branches of ACT in my work. So what is ACT? It's really practical. It's a set of 6 processes, which I won't go into at all in this recording, because we don't introduce those 6 processes in the workplace. We find if we do, then people get really heady, really cognitive. They want to understand. Whereas for me, ACT is really experiential. And it's what they call a third wave of cognitive behavioral therapy. But rather than talk about cognitive behavioral therapy and processes, let me go back and just share with you what the fundamental skills are that sit within ACT that we introduce to people in the workplace. So they are 3 skills of noticing, active, and open. And that's the way we present it to a workplace audience, because we want to make these skills as practical and useful as possible. So maybe I'll unpack them a bit. Would that be useful?
Yes, it'd be really useful.
So the skill of noticing. My proposition on noticing is that we don't always notice what's going on around us. In the workplace or in life in general, we can be stuck inside our own heads, living our life inside our own heads. So we can miss out on things going on around us, how other people are reacting to us, opportunities, threats going on in the workplace. And we can also miss out on how we're showing up, noticing how we're showing up. How am I impacting on myself and those around me? Am I showing up as the version of Ross that I'd be really proud of? Or would I look back on how I'm showing up and think, oh, God, that's embarrassing, or cringe, or just be mortified by how we might have shown up in a particular scenario? So we can hone our skills in noticing. We can really get better at that, because some research done at Harvard that suggested that in our waking hours, we can spend about 47% of our time with a wandering mind. And I'm not knocking the wandering mind, because without that, we wouldn't have great creativity, great architecture, great poetry, dance, literature, art, music. But sometimes that mind wandering overreaches itself, and we can find ourselves worrying, fretting about the past. Ruminating is a great word, ruminating about the past, or worrying about the future in that mental time travel. And when we're engaged in mental time travel, that's not always very healthy for us. So we can practice skills to bring our attention back to now, to the present moment, to enable us to find it more accessible so we can step into that moment and be present. So that's that noticing pillar.
I love that. And it's very, very much why I named the first of my pillars pause. And people often assume that when I say pause, I just mean come to stillness, which lots of us really struggle with, especially in the fast-paced modern environment we live in. It can be really hard to just pause and slow down. But what I really bring in there is the noticing that when we're running very fast, we also don't really notice things. It's that autopilot mode of not really dropping anchor into what's happening in the here and now because I'm fully occupied by the next thing. That's something I notice a lot amongst the clients I see. So noticing is a key skill that I teach as well. So I love how you've explained that, of noticing when we've time traveled and when we're no longer here because we're worried about the future, or we've now dwelling and ruminating and beating ourselves up for stuff we've done in the past. So let's move on to the next one.
Yeah. So the next one I'll talk about is active. And this, for me, is about an exploration. I often talk to groups and leaders and individuals about, let's explore what matters to you in, for example, your career. But it could be any area of life. It could be someone's leisure time. It could be their relationships. It could be their own health. What's their relationship with their own health? But for the purpose of this illustration, let's think about how you want to show up at work. What's important for you? What gives you meaning about how you are at work? And typically in group training or in coaching as well, we'd spend a bit of time exploring what really matters. And sometimes a way into this, just to give a practical little insight for your listeners, is to think about a time in the future when you're retiring from the workplace and all the laws of physics and time and space have been suspended and people from throughout your career are there. And just imagine that it's a great celebration of you in the workplace. And think about, what would you love to hear people say about how you were? Just really take some time to reflect on what would you love to hear people say about how you were in the workplace. And you might find words popping into your head or phrases. And maybe just jot them down. Because they give us some clues about what really matters to you. And it probably won't be things like, I delivered project X to time and to budget. It would probably be more about your behavior, how you made people feel, how you helped people along, how you lifted people up on their journey through the workplace, how you created a vision. So it could be all sorts of things like that, and you'll have your own, but it just gives us an insight into what matters. And we call those personal values sometimes in our work. So what personal values, what are these qualities of behavior that give you meaning? And then the next challenge is, how can we use those abstract words as a guide for our behavior? How can we use them as like a beacon for how we show up in the world? Taking small steps towards really expressing those values or those qualities of behavior in how we are. So that's kind of a brief intro. Does that land with you?
Yeah, and I think, again, coming into the second pillar of pause, purpose, play, there we are. It's what feels purposeful and meaningful. And I love the phrase of, what lights a fire within you? What is the thing that is, matters the most? And I remember when I attended training with you, Ross, that, how we were sorting through our values of what we prioritize and what kind of words bring up the most heat in us. What is the lukewarm ones? And what is that slightly colder ones? And it can be really hard to think about values because all of it can feel so meaningful, and it can feel really tricky to not get hooked by thoughts around, but maybe I should like this, or maybe I should value that. And I see that a lot with my work, with my clients, that they almost have a pressure to pick certain words and preconceived notions about themselves. So I want to definitely come back to that once you explain the last pillar as well of open.
Yeah, it's a lovely box to unpack, that values box. So let's come back to it. So the third pillar is open. And the kind of strapline to this pillar, I would say, is skillfully relating to the inner world. Now that might sound a bit woo-woo, but what I mean is there's stuff going on between our ears. Our mind is generating things like thoughts, emotions, memories, sensations, urges, and all that stuff going on that our mind's generating. Sometimes it can be useful, and sometimes it can be really, really unhelpful. It can leave us stuck in unproductive loops or habits that no longer work for us. Perhaps they once worked, but because the situation or the context around us has changed, they're no longer useful, but we persist with them because they've just become ingrained as a habit. And sometimes that stuff our minds produce, we take as 100% true and 100% worthy of our full attention, when actually what we can do in ACT is share skills that just help us get a bit of distance between ourselves and the thoughts our minds produce. And that distance, if we can practice that, that's some of the healthiest psychological space we can have as a human being.
Absolutely. And I think I want to ask more about psychological flexibility in a minute as well, because I still remember what you said about that in your training and how important that is for mental well-being. But that's where I also think of play and the pause, purpose, play bit, that radical openness I often lean back onto, of having that playful relating to what goes on in your mind. It's like, oh, here it is again. Here's that story I tell myself all the time. Or for the benefit of anyone who's watching the video, I'm going to show a picture of one of the things that shows up in my mind, which is a picture of Bob. That's
right about.
Here's Bob.
Beautiful. Hello,
he's
Bob.
An albatross. That the playful relating to our mind and the characters that brings up, and the inner self-assessment and self-awareness that we have of who we are and how we show up. And yeah, Bob the albatross is someone who sometimes wreaks havoc and sometimes has a great perspective on things. So when we have that playful relating to it, that open and radical acceptance of everything that shows up in your head, we start to not struggle so much against it and not fight it the same way. And like, why am I thinking that stupid thought? Oh, here it is again. Here's that thought I'm noticing, and can then take action in line with my values. So let's think about that. Let's think about the psychological flexibility and how does that fit with all the stuff that we talked about in terms of ACT?
Yeah, so let me talk about it this way. So if you think about those skills from ACT of noticing, active and open, so notice, active, open, they all contribute to the cultivation of our psychological flexibility. And this is a really interesting concept. To try and explain it, I'd say, again, I'd probably use the workplace as an example. But can we show up in the workplace really representing what has meaning and purpose for us? And be aware of what's going on around us. So if we need to adjust our path or our trajectory, we can do so. And we're not overly influenced or derailed by the unhelpful content that our minds produce. And for me, this just really represents the workplace of today, the relentlessness of the modern workplace. And it can feel like the goalposts are changing every day or so, new targets, new priorities, new contexts, and it just can feel quite exhausting, confusing, and we want to give adults these skills to enhance their own psychological flexibility, to help them navigate the workplace and all that it contains more effectively whilst looking after their own health.
So what do people then do if they're in a workplace that is not healthy or even outright toxic, which is a word that's thrown about a lot. Toxic environments. What are your thoughts around how we relate to an environment that might be toxic?
Yeah, it's a big topic. And you're right. People just throw around that toxic word quite willy-nilly. But I think if people are in an environment, first of all, it's recognizing that. It's recognizing how that environment is impacting upon them and perhaps, I guess, weighing them down, and maybe to leave them feeling disconnected, demotivated, demoralized, depressed, stressed, anxious. So the first step is recognizing. The next point I'd have is maybe just exploring what matters to you, and can you start to represent that in small ways in how you're showing up, whilst exploring that unhelpful stuff from the mind. When you're moving towards what matters, the mind often generates content that is really unhelpful and can take you away from being that person with meaning and purpose. So relating to that stuff differently and getting a view on this environment you find yourself in, this potentially toxic environment, maybe getting perspectives from others too, because I think that's always useful when you feel yourself stuck in this environment. And giving yourself that support, and I love your use of pause. Giving yourself that pause to think, and it's easy for me to say this, I completely get that, but do I want to continue in this environment? Is it within my gift to make changes to the structure or the hierarchy or whatever it might be in this environment? And if so, how do I do that? And at the extreme, perhaps thinking about finding another environment to work in. It's a really tricky one. I think it's something I work with individuals, and organizations really need to pay attention to their structures, their processes, their reward systems to ensure that it's, as best they can, it's as healthy as possible for folks.
Yeah, agreed. And it's also the classic psychologist answer of, well, it depends. Yes, it depends on the individual, it depends on the organizational structure, and it depends on so many factors. And sometimes it can be hard when we have these clickbaity terms like toxic environments, because what is toxic to one person may not be to another. So I think of it as more as like having conversations, curious conversations, compassionate conversations with individuals about, is this fertile soil for you or not? Is this soil where you can feel like you can put your roots down, where you can grow, where you feel nurtured or not? Doesn't really matter if the next person, the next desk over is thriving and you are not, because then it's still not fertile soil for you. And I guess also how much of that, toxicity is coming from within you, from your own internal high pressures and demands you place on yourself, high expectations that isn't met from the workplace, where they're not actually demanding the things that you're demanding of yourself. And unfortunately, sometimes it's both. I've certainly seen clients where they're in highly demanding, unrealistically pressurizing environments, and they come at it with that content in their heads, the stories that they bring with them, that they're not enough, that they are failing, that they're not good enough, that they're imposters. They bring that very self-critical mindset, means that they kind of got a recipe for burnout there when you have the external pressure meeting the internal pressure. What have you seen in terms of that, Ross, when you work in the workplace?
Yeah, absolutely. I see a lot of people who are so hard on themselves. This is why I think it's a revelation for the workplace to start exploring those things that our minds produce. Things like thoughts, things like, for instance, some of my thoughts, I'm not good enough. I'm not clever enough to work with these stupendous people. I'm going to be discovered for the fraud and the charlatan that I am. What will people think of me? They're going to think I'm an idiot. Now, that's just a small sample of the multitude that makes up my own unhelpful inner world. And you can see, hopefully, how they could derail me. But I know people I've worked with have just keep going. just keep going. You're not good enough. You need to keep going. That's not to the quality I expect. People who have these kind of perfectionistic internal dialogues going on that really drive them, and sometimes that can be useful. Sometimes that's helped them get to where they've got to. But sometimes in particular contexts, it becomes really, really unhelpful. And I find that the thoughts people have, if you get them to start to write them down, they would never talk to another human being like that. Somebody they love, a friend, a colleague, a partner, a child, they would never talk to them like that. And this is why in our ACT training, we're really looking to cultivate this skill of noticing in a particular way, noticing with curiosity and kindness. And that's where people in a workplace would start saying, oh, here's Ross with his soft skills, which really gets my goat when people start talking about, oh, the soft skills. They even use that voice, like the soft skills. And I'm like, there ain't nothing soft about these skills, mate, because these are really hard to do. Extending compassion to ourselves and those around us is difficult, and it has immense rewards for us and those around us.
Absolutely agree. And it's not even just in the sort of cost effectiveness, crass productivity way of looking at it from a corporate mindset point of view, because it does those things too. We are more likely to reach our goals when we are kinder to ourselves. But it's also because we deserve to be well. And all of our colleagues around us deserve to be well and happy. And it's that sort of loving kindness meditation that I find very helpful when we think, my boss deserves to be well, or this colleague deserves to be well. Everyone deserves to feel safe and secure and okay at work. And often people don't. I would love to hear more about that and what you see. Anything that you see in the workplace at the moment, any trends, trends is not the right word, but any indications that this is what we're dealing with in 2024 in the workplace? What do you see?
Yeah, I'll go anecdotally. I don't have research at my fingertips on this, but I mentioned the R word before, relentless. I think people are finding the workplace relentless, exhausting, demanding, not enough hours in the day. People are just finding they describe it as having back-to-back meetings. And sometimes people will describe back-to-back meetings as that's a highly productive state to be in. Well, I would gently push against that. If we're measuring our productivity by how many meetings we're having, maybe we need to sort of broaden our measure or add different components to it, because I think we'll all appreciate what it's like to have back-to-back meetings and how, I don't know about anyone else, but my mind wandering, me becoming less productive, me becoming less prepared, me not thinking, how do I want to show up in this interaction now? Me just going in and winging it. And sometimes that winging it can work. I've got a fair few years' experience of the workplace under my belt. And sometimes winging it can go terribly, terribly wrong. So what else am I seeing? I'm seeing lots of people just driving themselves, what I consider to be too hard. People who are unrelenting on themselves. And driving in a clear direction towards burnout. And we've got evidence to show that ACT can significantly reduce burnout. There's a number of studies that really support that. And when we think about the typical sort of recovery time from burnout, it can be a year, 2 years. So this is part of what motivates me to get up in the morning, is that I can share these really evidence-based practical skills from ACT with adults who probably haven't been taught these skills at school or in any type of further education or training. And we know they can be super useful to support the development of this psychological flexibility, but also the development of an enhancement of their own psychological well-being.
Absolutely. And I think that sort of summarizes what we talked about with the internal pressure and the external pressure, that the relentlessness of the environment around you, if that is met with your own unrelenting high standards, then, of course something's going to crack.
Mm.
And I think it's that sense of wherever you go, there you are. If you leave that toxic environment and move into another one or create your own company, if you bring that same content with you, the same stories, the same unrelenting high standards, you will create another toxic environment somewhere else. And so it's really difficult for people to soften and soothe and notice and be kind and caring towards themselves when the environment is saying, yeah, but do that in your own time and now work through lunch.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. These things that turn into sort of badges of honor in the workplace, like, oh, I worked through my lunch again. And you see someone crouched over a keyboard, they're not even noticing the food they're putting in their body. It's like they've got a nose bag on, but never mind because they're doing more work.
Yeah.
That breaks my heart to see that. And I've been there. I've done that. And people sending emails at 11 p.m., midnight. And what breaks my heart is when other people respond.
Yeah.
Like, oh, the boss has just sent me an email at midnight. Oh, seen it on my phone or my laptop's open. I'll respond now and go, hey, boss, aren't we cool?
Yeah.
And then the people who come in at 9 the next morning or when they get back from leave go, oh, I can see this interaction taking place in the middle of the night. Does that mean I have to do that?
Mm.
It looks like the boss is pretty pleased that person responded. So I remember are they being rewarded for that? Because maybe I have to do that too.
And then we have expectation.
These cycles of, I'm going to use that word again, toxicity.
Yeah. And those patterns of demand and needing to give that, I guess it's supply and demand. How much supply have we got? How long can we do that? And it's a real risk of them feeling expendable. And, well, I'll just burn out when they replace me with someone else. And that can be really difficult if you're like kind of climbing the ladder and you're more and more senior, in C-suite or executive positions. It's not so easy to just replace you. And that puts even more pressure. Of the amount of women I've worked with who've said, I get that I'm on the brink of burnout. I can't keep doing this much longer. But what's it going to do without me? Like, I have to come to work or I have to be up at 2 a.m. and do these things because otherwise how will it get done? And I think that we're in a really dangerous era where we have this feeling that something really bad will happen and we will explode if we don't get these things done.
Mm. Another thing I see around the boardroom table is comparisonitis.
Yeah.
Comparing ourselves with others and feeling like we're lacking. We mentioned imposter syndrome or phenomenon. And fear going on around meeting tables, boardroom tables. Fear of getting something wrong.
Yeah.
And also not surfacing assumptions. That's another thing I've noticed over the last few years of people sitting around a boardroom table and not having a collective assumption about what the purpose is, not surfacing those at all. So they each have their individual assumption. It can be super useful to surface those and articulate them because then we can agree a purpose for this team rather than everyone just banging away, assuming that they're thinking exactly what the person over the table is thinking.
Yeah. How are you going to know where to put your efforts if you don't know what the intention is? What's the bigger vision? What are you doing? What are you working towards? And I do find that very interesting, seeing the research studies on showing the importance of meaning at work. That when you don't know the purpose of your role, when you don't feel that there's a reason for why you carry this task out, you're not going to want to do it. And even more so if you have a neurodivergent mind, where like these low incentive tasks are impossible for you to carry out and you get demand avoidance, then that gets another burnout cycle in itself. You avoid and procrastinate. And then suddenly the depression, the demand has grown and you can't keep up with it.
Yeah.
It's a tough world we're living in at the moment where we're so clued and we're so hyper-connected and yet more isolated and alone than we've ever been.
Agreed.
Do you see that as well in the workplace at the moment, with the sort of the sense of hyperconnectivity that we now, obviously you and I are connecting over this call on, and you're in Spain, you're a different country to me. So do you notice anything to do with that, the connection piece, when we live in a hyper-tech world?
Yeah, I think again, from my own experience, I think people are misusing that connectivity. And sometimes it's difficult to find a channel which someone has contacted me on. Was it a WhatsApp? Was it an email? Was it a instant messenger type service? Or was it on social media? They just thought of me and sent something. I think it makes things really difficult to track down, but it also makes us super connected and accessible, which I think people don't pause to think, should I be mentioning this to Ross, or should I just pause and think what the solution to this might be, rather than just pinging Michaela and saying, hey, what's the answer to this? Panic, 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 it's urgent. When actually, it's probably not urgent. I don't need to bother you, and maybe I could leave it till our next catch-up. But there's this urgency that can escalate. I often talk to leaders about how they're role models in organizations. People are looking to them for cues on how should I communicate? How should I relate to my co-workers and stakeholders? How do I behave when there's a crisis? And they will copy that.
Yeah.
I've seen it so much in organizations. We copy the leader.
Well, that's, monkey see, monkey do. We know that when the influential authority tells us this is what we do. We've seen some harrowing research examples of where people blindly follow authority. So the way we talk about embodying kindness, care, and compassion in our leadership is really important, because if you want your staff to take care of themselves and be kind and not stay up until 11 o'clock to answer emails, you have to make sure you don't either. Otherwise, they will monkey see, monkey do. My boss is answering emails, so maybe I need to as well, and expectation grows.
Or the leader who goes on leave for 2 weeks, and then suddenly you start getting emails from them. From the beach in Honolulu, you're getting on with your work, and they're suddenly just responding to clients or stakeholders or other people. Yeah. It's like, no. What are you showing to your people, that you go on leave and take your laptop and sit answering emails?
Yeah.
No. And
it's
that's
shocking, isn't it?
Also sends really damaging messages about trust as well.
Yeah. That you can't step away and trust that people around you have got your back and they can do their job diligently.
Yeah, because we're all indispensable.
Yes. When we're not. We're really not. I'm going away to Vietnam on Friday, which I've talked about on this podcast a bit before, and my spacious adventure, as I call it. Not my space adventure, that's a different trip, but my spacious adventure. And it's really made me realize of who I want to be as a leader in my team, and making it really clear to my team that I will not be having any notifications on. I will not be contactable via email. I will not be bringing my laptop. I will not approve any content. None of the things like that will happen. And whatever we prepare before I go, great. Otherwise, they will hold the fort, and whatever be will be. And if there's an episode of the podcast missed for a week, whatever, I need my sanity, and my team needs to be, shown that I trust that they've got this. They have enough operating procedures to do stuff in my absence. I never wanted to build a business where I was indispensable, because what's the point of that? The things I teach around creating a spacious business and preventing burnout and letting go of perfect. I can't do that and then sit there and nitpick things from Hoi An in Vietnam. That doesn't work, right?
No, not at all. So great to hear you're role modeling that for your team and your business.
I try. It's work in progress. As we all are humans. And I know that obviously on your own podcast, People Soup, which will feature me soon in the future, you also talk a lot about how ACT has shown up for you and how you've used it in your own life. So I would like to hear a little bit more about that. What's the difference that ACT has made in your life, Ross?
It's brought me great clarity, I would say. It's helped me one of the profound things it's done is help me relate to my own anxiety in a more workable and productive way, to get that distance I mentioned. The distance between me and my anxious mind is something I absolutely treasure, because previously I would get really tangled up in those anxious thoughts, like what will people think of me? And they still are around, those thoughts, but the beauty of it is I have skills now to relate to them differently and lessen their impact. So I call my mind, I've got a playful nickname for my mind. I call my mind the head of drama, because I come from a long line of catastrophizers, and I can escalate an everyday occurrence to utter catastrophe in nanoseconds. And that then really influences what I do next, or used to influence more, now less so. So that influences what jobs I bid for or what projects I accept. And now I really will accept those scary things. And say, I can notice that head of drama's getting a bit vocal. And what's important to me about this? What's my purpose here? My purpose is being of service to adults in the workplace, being creative in the way I bring things to the workplace, and being persistent, because you don't learn these skills overnight. Other areas where it's really influenced me, as you mentioned, I live in Spain. Who knew that I would live in Spain 5 years ago even? But this was something that happened. I do have a Spanish husband, which helps. And it was something we started to discuss in the pandemic, because we were in Spain. We had to get special permission. Unfortunately, we had a family member who was terminally ill, so we were spending time with them. And whilst it was a horrible and devastating time, I was also working full time, and we began to think, hey, this is quite nice. Should we think about just doing it? And long story short, we upped stakes. We lived in Brighton. We sold up there, and we moved to Spain. And we didn't have it all mapped out. I'd typically be the person who wants to map it out. If I'm cooking, I have all the ingredients weighed out before I start. But this, I knew if we did that, mapped out each step, each bureaucratic process, it was never going to happen. So we just moved and rented a flat for 9 months in Malaga. Then we ended up in Seville. So that would have never happened to me without the skills from ACT, without us really setting our intention, our joint intention and our purpose around creativity, around adventure, and knowing that lots of bureaucracy, lots of things that were magnified in their complexity by Brexit, that have been an utter headache, but I wouldn't change it for the world. It's been a roller coaster. It hasn't all been sunshine and sangria. There's been real challenges, and wouldn't change it at all. What date is it today? It's the 24th of January. We had lunch sitting outside in our garden. How cool is that?
Yeah.
How cool is it to step out into my garden just to appreciate and connect with nature in that way? It's something that astounds me every day.
And you moved from Brighton, which is, beautiful in itself. So it wasn't like, you'd not been in a scenic part of the world. Exactly. But it just goes to show that when we have that openness to experience, when we have that ability to notice our own mind, we can then take action in a way that feels aligned with who we want to be and the life we want to build. And your adventure to Seville and the routes that it's taken you to get there, it's sometimes we come to those purposeful things through painful experiences, like caring for a family member. And I keep saying that's the most important thing I take away from all the guests I've interviewed. Whenever they tell me about something they're passionate about or that feels particularly purposeful to them, it is often a story of pain behind it that makes us choose wisely, or how we want to be and where we want to go and how we want to show up and what we want the rest of our lives to look like. So yeah, sometimes we have to pause for that pain to be invited in and sit with it and think, what does this mean? What do I choose? So I really value how much you share that on People Soup as well, where we hear lots of lovely stories about everything from your cycling to, yeah, just how you've navigated your own life. And that makes it more relatable. So I wanted to see if we can start to draw things to a close by doing a little practical thing that we said we would use as an example, a metaphor that is often used within ACT called passengers on the bus.
Yeah, I'd love to. It's something that we develop. Well, no, let me be clear. I didn't develop this metaphor, but it's something that me and my colleague, Dr. Paul Flaxman at City University of London, that we included in our training protocol. And Michaela came on that training. It feels like years ago. I think it was 2019. It was in the olden days when we did in-person training. But let me just have a go at presenting the passengers on the bus metaphor to the listeners. So imagine you're the driver of your bus of life, and hopefully you can take this bus in a direction that has that meaning and that purpose for you. And the moment you turn on the ignition and start moving forward, there's lots of chatter starts up behind you. And we call these your passengers. And these are like your thoughts. And these passengers are clever because they know what you're thinking. They know what you're thinking even before you do stuff. And as you move along towards what's important to you, some of those passengers are just a bit mundane. They're saying, oh, must remember to buy milk when I go to the supermarket and I've run out of tea bags, and must reply to that email. So that's just fairly mundane, nothing of great importance there. Some of them are quite nice. They're saying, hey, Ross, love being on your bus. You're a great driver. And we can see you're moving towards what matters, and we can see you're also maybe thinking of just adjusting that route slightly, taking a right turn down a new avenue. Well, we think go for it. We think you've got all the skills to do this, and we think it'll end up in a really great place. So mirror signal maneuver, just crack on. Other passengers are a bit different. Some of the other passengers are saying, Ross, the seats on your bus are really uncomfortable. And we can see you're thinking of taking this new route. Well, really? Because we know deep down you just like going in that circular route round and round the city. That's where you feel really comfortable and safe. You might see other bus drivers going off at jaunty angles, but that's not for you. Don't compare yourself to them because you'll just find yourself lacking. You know where you really want to be is just going round and round and round where you feel safe. So don't feel the need to do anything new. Just keep going round. And then there's another group of passengers, and these ones are quite loud for me. These are saying, Ross, have you even got a license for this vehicle? Because you're such a shit driver. Everyone else is better than you. You're awful. And we can see you're thinking of doing this new thing. Well, really? Are you joking? Really? Because we know what's going to happen. There's going to be a series of unfortunate events ending in utter catastrophe. And it'll end in just devastation. So, in fact, just pull the bus over. Stop. Pull up. You're not worthy of driving this. And that is how we first introduced the metaphor of the passengers on the bus to a workplace group. And we find that sometimes people are just like sitting there like, really? It just resonates. It speaks to the human experience. But some people are saying, oh, I thought it was just me who had thoughts like that. We're not told that we all experience this stuff, this unhelpful stuff. So it's a real privilege sometimes, these moments where we share that.
And as we just had a little mini interruption here, I noticed my passengers on the bus. It's funny how much richer our life and our experience becomes when we can just notice it. Oh, I'm noticing thoughts around failure and not being prepared, and I'm noticing worry of what will Ross think that I interrupted him mid-flow. It's really fascinating on what we can see when we're able to just look at it from slightly more of a distance, like, Look at you sitting there in the back, piping up. And I'm going to return back to doing what matters to me here, which is connecting with you. So loving this metaphor. And how would you take it forwards to what this means in reality in the workplace, where people have learned how to notice the passengers that they have?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, just noticing those passengers, because most of the time they're operating at a level that's sort of on autopilot. They're influencing our behavior in a way that we barely notice. So by shining a light on them, just by even just writing it down, that can begin to change our relationship by getting those words out there on a page. Our everyday unhelpful thoughts can really help us start to change our relationship with them and shift that pattern. And often people in the workplace will say to me, hey, I know what I do. I just throw all my passengers off the bus. And my heart sinks a little bit, because that's probably how we've all been raised. And school, just don't think about it. Don't think of a purple cow in a blue field. And all we can think about now is a purple cow in a blue field. So when we say don't, it's a daft piece of advice to ourselves or to others. So we're not looking to get rid of these passengers. What we're looking to do is change our relationship with them, because we know if you do manage to get them off the bus, they're crafty. They tend to run down the street, put on a disguise and get on at the next stop with a big false nose on or funny glasses. And they still then do their work on us. So in the training, we build on this metaphor, and sometimes in the workplace, we end up acting it out, which is great fun to do. And it really consolidates those messages about how if we're struggling and fighting with our passengers, arguing with them, then we're using up our own energy, but we're not moving our bus towards what matters.
Yeah, you take your eye off the road as well, and your engine halts, and suddenly you're stuck and you're not driving towards the destination, having the journey that you want to have. So it's a really tricky one, isn't it? Sometimes I find it helpful also to think of it as your passengers are part of you. So it's like trying to cut your nose off to spite your face. You can't throw them all off. So sometimes we can play around with like an image of, you turn around and it's all basically versions of you wearing different wigs and costumes. And it's just the version of you that is very anxious sits there to the left, and the version of you that's self-critical sits further back. And then, maybe that's the version of you that's angry looking and, spikier hair, etc. And it's like still versions of you. And if you try to throw them all off, well, where are you going to go? They are still part of you, but you don't want them to completely dictate where you go and decide where you drive your bus. Like you were given the example of the round and round, the circular path around the city. Why is that a problem though? Why, I'm being flippant now, so because I obviously know where you would go. Why is that a problem to just play it safe and go around on that path where we've always been?
Depending on the context, it might not be a problem. That might be a really effective route for someone. But if it's causing them distress, if they're feeling like, oh, I know I've got an itch, I know there's something else, but I'm not sure what it is, I want to set sail, but I can't do that, that's not for me, that's not who I am, then that's when it becomes a problem, when we're feeling stifled or just not allowed to be our true selves, not allowed to fulfill our purpose. That's when it becomes a problem. Sometimes it might be fine to just keep doing what we've done.
Yeah, and sometimes there might be times where you choose to consciously stay in your comfort zone, because that's a great way to survive a hard phase in your life. I saw this, I'm sure you did as well, through the pandemic, that people are reaching for familiarity and comfort in a way that they had never done before. So doing the same thing over and over again, reading childhood books or watching old reruns of TV shows that they watched when they were younger, when they felt safe. And that can also be okay. So there's no shame in it. It's just about choosing wisely, isn't it? What gives you the best consequences? And everything you said is basically captured in Moana, isn't it? Right? If you feel that you've been pulled back to the water and you want to just see how far you can go, then maybe you do need to take that right turn with the bus, despite the passengers in the back saying, no, that's scary, or no, you're too weak, or you can't do it. So we're doing it anyway, right? What kind of words of wisdom do you have for people around how they take action towards what matters to them when they have all these active passengers inside their head?
Yeah, it's kind of reframing it a bit. It's kind of, am I willing to experience the chatter of my passengers in the service of moving towards what matters to me? For me, that really reframes it for me. It's things like, yeah, I can listen to you, and I'm moving towards something that has real purpose. And I'll fall off the wagon, if that's probably not the right expression. I'll fall off the horse, perhaps, is a better expression. I'll fall off the horse many times. But can I get back on it and persist with that path, even when my passengers are getting quite vocal? Because as I make progress, they sometimes get more vocal.
Yeah, and sometimes that's an indication that you're doing exactly the thing you need to be doing.
Exactly.
Because fear shows up. Oh, scary, can't do this. Stay in the comfort zone. You drove your bus to Seville, and, I drove mine to the UK. Not sure what I was thinking there, because clearly I should have driven to your country, where it's warm. But that's the kind of thing that gets us to stretch ourselves further and see what else is there and how far can we go. So I really appreciated the conversation we've had. And, although it's been linked around the workplace, it's been very much wisdom that we all need, regardless if we're employed or running our own business or taking care of children. That we all need to find ways to pause and notice, to be actively engaging with what matters to us and what feels purposeful, and to be playfully open to whatever life brings us so we can drive that bus. And as a final word of wisdom, Ross, would it be anything you wanted to give to the listeners as a final takeaway, as a permission to give them or a pressure to take off them? What would that be?
Yeah. Love this question. So I would say, can you get into the habit of asking yourself and others around you, what are you doing today to recharge your batteries? We don't normalize the recovery from our daily toils, or maybe that's work, maybe that's other stresses and strains on us, caring responsibilities. But what are you doing to recharge your batteries? Get used to asking yourself that with that curiosity and kindness, and asking each other.
Yeah, I love that question. I even ask my husband sometimes what percentage is his battery at, to know what capacity he has and what capacity I have. And then we can choose wisely who does what. Do we need to swap? Do we need to lean this way or that way? Who needs a bit of self-care? Who needs compassion? Who needs to be topped up? And quantifying it that way can also make it less of a personal sense of failure. It's just, well, my batteries are low. You wouldn't tell your phone that it's having a personal failure because it's 22% battery. You would just plug it in.
Exactly.
It's not a shortcoming or weakness. It is just the battery is running low. So we changed our relationship to that. So I've really, really valued everything you've said today. And I can't believe it's been 4 or 5 years in the making, Ross. We talked about this in 2019, but we've made it happen. And I will make sure that I will also link people to People Soup and for them to keep a lookout for when you're going to be turning the tables on me, because there will be involving a song choice. And I'm really, really excited about that. So thank you so much for your wisdom today.
Thank you, Michaela. It's been a delight and a privilege. Thank you.